welcome for being here. My name is Alden. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs and African Studies Center. And this is Eye on Africa, our weekly seminary service. We are very delighted today to have Dr. Alden Young as our guest speaker, and we thank you very much, Dr. Mara Lehman, who invited him here. And without further ado, I'm just gonna give her the privilege of introducing our guest. So Mara, I if you just bring the thing to you so you can introduce our guest.
Well, thank you, Ella. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mara Lightman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Alden Young, who will be speaking on the new triangular trade managing inequality across Arabia during the long 1970s. Dr. Young is an associate professor of history and global affairs at Yale University. He's a political and economic historian of Africa and the Middle East, and he has written extensively about Sudan and is currently working on a number of research projects that examine the impact of the Arab Gulf states in the 1970s on the greater Red Sea region. Dr. Young is also writing a book on post-partition conflicts in the Horn of Africa, such as Sudan, South Sudan, and Ethiopia-Eritrea conflicts, with political scientist Michael Woldemariam. Dr. Young comes to Yale from UCLA, where he was an associate professor of African American Studies and a standing member of the faculty in the International Institute. And before that, he taught for 5 years in the history department at Drexel University. He's also been a fellow of the Berggruen Institute and a member of the School of Social Science at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. He is author of Transforming Sudan, Decolonization, Economic Development, and State Formation, published by Cambridge in 2017, with a paperback release in 2020. He has also published in numerous academic journals and writes frequently in popular forums like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and November Magazine. I also just learned he's a Detroiter, so welcome back to Michigan, Professor Young.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I was just saying, yeah, I lived in Detroit until about 2004, so it's a nice chance to come back to Michigan. And thank you, Mara and Awa and everyone else for organizing my trip. Today, my talk is entitled, I think the book, hopefully, that this talk will be part of will eventually be called The Afrabians. And I'll explain a little bit during the talk where that phrase, the Afrabians, comes from. But the talk today will focus on one of the chapters of the book that looks at sort of the mid-1970s and raises this question of what a new triangular trade might look like. And during the talk, we can talk about, the use of some of these phrases and why they might pop up in the mid-1970s. But my work right now kind of focuses on what I describe as the Red Sea region. And I like to use one of these studies from a few years ago from the U.S. Institute for Peace to think about, what is the Red Sea? What does it mean for us in this moment? And for the United States, we'll see that the Red Sea primarily as a problem of, we might consider peace and stability or security and conflict and war. And I didn't know Signal Gate would happen so soon to remind us of what the Red Sea means from the American perspective. And there's a long literature on the question of, whether or not we think of the Red Sea as a region. And for me, I kind of came to this project as one of those questions of area studies also. And so as someone who was interested in Sudan, the first thing that always happened, even when I was in graduate school, would be this question of, okay, you're focusing on Sudan. Particularly, I focused on, sort of northern Sudan. Am I focusing on Africa or the Middle East? And as you think about Sudanese history and a sort of post-colonial history, the question comes up repeatedly, even how you tell the story. And one of the stories, I think, since the 1970s, but we could talk about whether or not it's an older story, has been Khartoum's increased sort of alignment with what we might see as the rise of the Arabian Peninsula within even modern Middle Eastern studies. And, what does that rise of the Arabian Peninsula also mean? Tell us about contemporary African history. So this project came to me. I was in Khartoum, I think in each of the year, like in the last few years before the 2019 revolution that overthrew 30 years of Omar al-Bashir's rule in Sudan. And in the years right up to and immediately after, I think I went to Khartoum maybe 6 months after the revolution as well. You started to see this return of a kind of neo-Nubianism. And I noticed that one of the interesting things about both the revolution and many of the culture makers leading up to the revolution was that they had what we might interpret as a kind of Afrocentricity, but many of them, many of the intellectuals or the young professionals who played a role in the revolution had sort of developed their understanding of an Afrocentricity actually while they were part of the larger migration to the Arabian Peninsula. And so, what is Blackness and what does the re-export of Blackness mean coming from the Arabian Peninsula? And in many ways in the literature, when I was in grad school in the early 2000s, the principal frame was the export of Arabism from the Arabian Peninsula. And so what does it mean if something else is being exported now? And is it just a question of who is doing the export, or is there actually a sort of cultural shift going on in the Arabian Peninsula? And does that have wider implications for the region as a whole? And also, as I've been doing more work on the Red Sea region, we were doing work on climate change. It's also one of the most unequal regions in the world, right? And so you have if you think of the Red Sea region as stretching, the way I kind of frame it, from the Persian Gulf, into the Sahel, you see some of the wealthiest states in the world, but also some of the poorest states in the world. And what do we make of the idea? I want to argue that it is actually a fairly integrated labor market, economic zone. What does it mean that these inequalities are persisting or perhaps being manufactured by this integration? And so this is Mayada Adil. She is a Sudanese doctor, but also a fashion designer. Her family lives in Riyadh, but in the years before the revolution, she had returned to Sudan and was doing this kind of cultural production work, and now has become a UN youth ambassador, and so has developed this, larger global platform. But I remember interviewing her, and she was explaining to me that, part of it was that she was gone from Sudan during the years of partition. And when she returned, she was, at least in her narration, invested in a kind of neo-Nubianism as a way of thinking about the African presence that was missing, particularly the South Sudanese presence that was missing in the late 2010s. And then the other interesting thing, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is the question of the change between the 1970s and the relationship, or the imagined relationship between Northeast Africa and the Gulf states, and the relationship today. Right? Today, if you talk to most Sudanese activists or just many Sudanese in general, and I think this holds true in some ways if you think about Ethiopia, also Somalia, to a lesser extent, but also true Egypt. Kenya is a bit complicated. We can talk a little bit about Kenya. The relationship with the Gulf states is no longer seen as a very equal relationship, right? It is seen as a relationship of partial domination, in which more powerful actors are able to influence and to act in African countries without those states particularly being able to regulate that interaction. And perhaps nowhere is that crisis more obvious than in Sudan, where here you have, I know it's only his back, but Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the ruler of Abu Dhabi, perhaps the wealthiest of the Emirates. The Emirates are a confederation, so Abu Dhabi is the wealthiest emirate within the UAE, home to most of the oil. And you have a man who's become very prominent in Sudan, Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, often known as Hemeti, who is leader of the largest paramilitary force in Sudan, one that has created this sort of intra-military or intra-security service conflict that has wrecked Sudan since 2023. Recently, the capital, Khartoum, was recovered, and there have been a number of news stories in the US papers about this, but the capital has been largely wrecked, right? I mean, most, particularly the building stock of the capital has been destroyed. And it has created the largest displacement crisis perhaps in the world, but definitely the largest displacement crisis in Africa. Some people say between 12 and 15 million people have been displaced out of a population just over 40 or 45 million or so in Sudan. And so it is a huge crisis. But Sudanese activists have rightly pointed out that the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, are receiving significant amounts of support, logistical support, military support, and financial support from the United Arab Emirates. And there have been controversies about the nature of that support, but for instance, we have satellite photos that show us dual purpose infrastructure being built in places like Chad that can serve purposes, for instance, as field hospitals, but also military resupply stations. And more importantly, the Rapid Support Forces exist in their present form, which I would argue is as a sort of transnational private mercenary organization out of a longer engagement with the Gulf states, right? Perhaps the most transformative experience was the 2015 war in Yemen, in which the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia launched a ground offensive to accompany their air campaign in Yemen to defeat the Houthis, but quickly found out that they lacked sufficiently trained ground forces to wage the campaign. And in the place of UAE or Saudi ground forces, they returned to a strategy of mercenary recruitment. And mercenary recruitment took many forms. For instance, it was just after the peace agreement with the FARC and in Colombia. And so there were large numbers of Colombians, for instance, brought to Yemen. But the need for wholesale ground forces, perhaps the most convenient number of forces available, came from Darfur. And it was convenient for both the Sudanese regime in Khartoum and various factions in Darfur to participate because it was also a lull in the conflict in Darfur at that moment, and there were a surplus of soldiers to send. Young recruits, I've heard reports, are paid by the Emiratis $3,500 per month. The majority of that was taken, by military commanders of various types. Both Abdel Fattah Burhan, the commander of the Sudanese Armed Forces, and Hemeti were involved in the Yemen campaign. Burhan was perhaps, some people suggest, the military intelligence officer in charge of coordinating Sudanese participation in that campaign. But all of this is to say, right, that at this moment, the UAE is able to intervene in Sudan in ways that go beyond the kind of bilateral state-to-state relationship. It very much has its own proxy forces within the Sudanese state. The Sudanese economy also since 2013 has seen a rapid development in its gold exports. Sudan today is the third largest exporter of gold on the African continent, behind only South Africa and Ghana. And the vast majority of that gold, some people say upwards of 90-something%, is transported and resold through the markets of Dubai. And what makes the situation particularly dangerous is that the gold is gold is fueling the war, funding the campaign of both the Rapid Support Forces, but also the Sudanese Armed Forces, who develop gold in the eastern part of Sudan. The Rapid Support Forces control mines in the western part of the country, but all of the gold is going through the United Arab Emirates. And this is to say nothing of what today is also several million Sudanese, many of them professionals, who work and earn their daily livelihoods in the Gulf cooperation countries. And that situation has only been magnified by the current conflict. So even people who were able to work in Sudan previously, the Sudanese middle class has had to leave, and the Gulf states, though they do not take refugees, has still taken the largest number, or many of the best qualified of those families. How did I come to this project? So the book I'm currently writing, which hopefully will be called The Afrabians, is in many ways, it tries to use a biography. And we can talk about the problem of sources. It tries to use a biography of a Sudanese activist and intellectual named Muhammad al-Qasim Hajj Hamad, who becomes very active, who sort of emerges as a prolific writer in Sudan in the late 1960s, but starts off as a sort of student activist, never attends college formally, drops out of high school, but becomes very active. And one of the reasons I was attracted to him is becomes very active in the Ethiopian Civil War. And so I was interested initially in what did it mean for this Northern Sudanese man to become, one of his longest causes, multi-decade causes, is Eritrean independence. And so I was interested in what, this kind of Pan-Africanism looked like from the 1960s onwards. And then when I was in the Princeton Library, in graduate school, I discovered this book about the international aspects of the battle for Eritrea, or the Battle of Eritrea. And it became interesting for me. I hadn't really thought of the ways in which, conflicts in like the Ethiopian Civil War played out throughout the Arab world. And here Hajj Hamad becomes a propagandist in the Arabic newspapers for the Eritrean Liberation Front. And, and he's traveling back and forth to the Ba'athis in Syria, but also to Saudi Arabia, to Iran. And later in his writings, you see his dealings with the Israelis. And so it's a question of, in this sort of early 1970s or mid 1970s moment, what does the kind of greater Middle East conflict look like from the perspective of the Horn of Africa? And that for me became a very interesting question. And also, what was the circle of publications, right? So you could see that, even this book, which comes out in the early 70s, is being sold in Abu Dhabi, but it's also being sold in Eritrea, Beirut and Cairo, and Saudi Arabia. And so what does this geography sort of look like? And so I began to follow Muhammad al-Qasim Hajj Hamad. Here's a photo of him. He is actually very big, I discovered. It's one of these COVID projects where you're like, oh man, I might never be able to go to the archive ever again. But I discovered that he is very prolifically, even though he's not written about in English, his writings are much vaster than I initially expected. And were very helpfully sent to all the main libraries in the United States. And so it's also a question of the strategy, right? I mean, clearly he had publishing backing, and it was being deliberately pushed out. And we can talk a little bit about that strategy, or who was supporting him, why were these publications so prolific, and why were they forgotten? And so following him, I discovered that, Hajj Hamad's first posting to the Middle East would be as an Arab propagandist. He was sent to Beirut and told, to represent the Eritrean cause in the Beirut of the early 1970s. And in his own telling, right, this is also a convenient time to leave Sudan because the Numeri regime had come to power, the new military dictatorship. And after initially being open to a kind of leftist activism, and Hajj Hamad had been a leftist trade unionist, the the regime would quickly turn, right? And it would purge most of the members of the Sudanese Communist Party, but also leftists in general, from the Numeri regime in the early 1970s. And it's in that period of Hajj Hamad sort of in a self-imposed exile, with also many other Sudanese of different types, of different labor classes and stripes also having moved to the Middle East in this period, Beirut being one of the major hubs, that you see Hajj Hamad also trying to work out how to reframe what resistance to the regime in Khartoum would look like. And you also see him writing and coming to the conclusion, I mean, and this is part of a general factor of the Sudanese left, why did what we considered as the Sudanese left to be one of the largest civil revolutions in Sudan in the mid-1960s fail, right? It was perhaps the largest communist party in Africa, at least outside of North Africa. They had come to power with mass mobilization. Why were they unable to defend what they considered to be the democratic revolution in Sudan? And Hajj Hamad's ideas about this are, widely shared in kind of Sudanese leftist circles. The first answer is that we made a mistake, right? The mistake was that we assumed that it was possible to have a democratic revolution in a single country in Africa. And they were like, it's not possible to have an anti-imperial revolution when you are surrounded by counter-revolutionary states. And this also becomes Hajj Hamad's self-rationalization for his involvement in the Ethiopian Civil War. The crux of the Ethiopian Civil War is that Sudan cannot be free if Ethiopia is governed by Haile Selassie, and a regime that was seen to be counter-revolutionary, pro-American. And you see this kind of also discussion about Congo. And so there's an idea that there needs to be a sort of regional restructuring if there is going to be democratic reform in a country like Sudan. Also in Beirut, you see Hajj Hamad begin to self-narrate the connection of the struggles of the peoples of Northeast Africa with the question of Palestine. And I hadn't realized initially how many Africans actually lived in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon, right? I mean, in my mind, I guess I hadn't made that association, which I guess is obvious, but Hajj Hamad is describing this, and the Sudanese are living in those camps, and they are watching the Israeli aggression, and you can kind of see the ways in which writers like Hajj Hamad are connecting the two together. But also, and the rest of the talk will talk sort of about chapter 2, this question of Sharjah. Also, Hajj Hamad is of the generation that moves from what we might consider the old capitals of the Middle East, Beirut and Cairo, and is moving to the new capitals of the Middle East, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Doha, Riyadh to a certain extent, in the sort of emergence of the Gulf states. And for many people, the mid-1970s, I would discover for a number of African intellectuals, was actually a moment of opportunity, because they narrate, and you'll see it a little bit in Hajj Hamad in his own writings, that the eventual independence of the UAE in the early 1970s is actually the culmination of a larger Pan-Africanist struggle. And a story that we might tell, for him, one of the crucial moments is the sort of breaking of white control, minority control in Southern Africa, East Africa's revolutions, and then across the Red Sea, the fight in South Yemen. And it's in that context that Hajj Hamad says that it's the early 70s that the United Arab Emirates is able to become independent. And the twist would be, while many of the other African independence movements happened in circumstances of constraint, right? Economic constraint or other types of constraint, the UAE will become independent in the early 1970s. And it will experience in the 1970s 15% per year economic growth, right? So it becomes independent with the resources to develop. And for a number of East and Southern African scholars, people like Ali Mazrouhi, it's very fortunate that the UAE becomes independent at this time because a grand bargain is possible with Africa. Not only had Pan-Africanism created the context in which the Arabian Gulf could become independent. UAE becomes independent with great wealth, but also, as many of them say, the Eastern Arabian Peninsula lacks people. And so a kind of exchange is possible, right? African professionals can go to the Arabian Peninsula under the favorable version of this exchange, and build up the capacity of the new states of the Eastern Arabian Peninsula. And in exchange, African intellectuals and economists are saying that the Gulf states can recycle their surplus investments into Africa, and that there could be perhaps a more equal exchange. In 1976, one of the large potential institutionalizations of this arrangement occurs. There's a huge summit organized largely by Sudanese diplomats and intellectuals. One of the most famous is Yusuf Hassan Fadl, who is the great Sudanese historian, who by 1976 has built a personal relationship with the Sheikh of Sharjah. And the Sheikhs of Sharjah has come to the University of Khartoum with the explicit idea that they're going to either emulate or borrow Sudanese intellectual production and be able to build. They built this idea they were going to have an Africa Institute. It was going to, and today, for anybody who's interested, there is a new Africa Institute that is trying to revive this, or is self-consciously trying to revive some of this earlier discussion, but, and perhaps in a different context, but at this moment, there's this idea that this intellectual exchange can happen, that this professional exchange can happen, that is African countries that will provide the capacity building necessary to create these new states. The UAE being the newest of them. It's much newer than even Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. I guess the only peer would be Qatar, right? Sort of in that kind of frame. But that will develop in some ways a slightly later story. And many of the people coming, also there's a big presence of Zambians and others, not only people like Ali Mazrui. So you see E.C. Chibwe writes a number of books sort of in the frame of this conference in this mid-1970s moment. I think the one that comes out of the conference, the one that comes right before the conference and sort of serves as an intellectual frame is Arab Dollars for Africa. And then he writes Afro-Arab Relations in the New World Order right after the conference. And what was interesting to me is also the language that is being used, right? There is a kind of explicit reference also to the Arab slave trade and particularly East and Southern Africa. And for scholars like this is Yusuf Hassan Fadl more recently with Sheikh Sultan bin Muhammad al-Qasimi. And there's an extent to which Sharjah has continued to patronize a large number of Sudanese scholars. Yusuf Hassan Fadl, sort of embodies this sort of multi-decade relationship from the 1970s onwards. And the Emir of Sharjah also is a historian. And so I don't know if he was writing them, but he has many historical works under his name, sort of from the 16th century, ranging from the 16th century into the present, often with this kind of neo-anti-imperial tinge to it, the problem of the Portuguese, the problem of the British, and sort of the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean framework, this question of a kind of alternative relationship between Africa and the Middle East, are kind of hallmarks of this sort of writing. And Ali Mazrui, Chibwe brings up this idea of, a kind of almost like a reparations, right? The reason for the investment, not only would it be a new exchange, right? Not only is there a need, the Arabs have a need at this moment for African brain power, but how to think about this migration out of Africa in ways that don't echo the earlier migrations. right? Migrations that led, under conditions of enslavement, migrations under conditions of forced bondage, migrations of exploitation, right? How to reimagine a new migration in a way that wouldn't echo the same. And I was surprised by how mainstream these ideas are. Perhaps, one of the best of the, we might consider, I saw actually in his own writings, there's a division of Pan-Africans in the mid-1970s between those who become more, we might consider Islamophilic and Islamophobic, and perhaps one of the best knowns of the Islamophilic Pan-Africanists is Ali Mazrouhi. And in 1975 in Foreign Affairs, he's bringing up this question again, right? This question of what would be an exchange between Africa and the Arab world. And he says, it must be acknowledged, however, that Black Africa's share of OPEC assistance funds has been modest, right? So he's criticizing the Gulf states. He's saying that, and this is a widely shared assumption, the Gulf states are able to do the things that they're able to do in the mid-1970s because they're building on the backs of, things like the G77 and the General Assembly. They're building on the back of African independence. But if they're going to do things like raise the price of oil, if they're going to break, cause economic hardship in African countries, they should be providing more assistance. And if the aspirations of much of Black Africa are not to be frustrated, Afro-Arab relations clearly cannot reduce themselves to intra-Muslim relations, nor can economic interaction between Africa and the Middle East be limited to small and sporadic aid flows. Multilateral aid and bargaining, as well as interregional trade, need to be institutionalized in the years ahead. Like the issue of slavery, another form of Black energy, the present importance of oil is posing new questions about the future relations amongst the Arabs, the Africans, and the Western world. At least since the Middle East War of 1973, the Middle East and Africa have edged a little closer towards becoming a single international subsystem. There are, as we have seen, hazards in the relations between Africa and the Middle East, as well as unfulfilled promises. A good deal will depend upon the Arab world capacity to transcend the temptations of power and influence and to maintain a broad solidarity with Africa as a sound foundation for an Afro-Arab diplomatic and economic front. And Mazrouhi would develop this idea in numerous articles from 1975 going forward, right? Another one of his most famous articles actually has the title Afrabia, where I got that idea from, written right after 1991, in which he also talks about this idea of a need for an African-Arab reconciliation. And he says, it would necessitate a confrontation or a confrontation with the legacy of the slave trade, right? But also a more equal relationship. And he's saying this, I think, at a very important time in 1991, because it's in the wake of the Gulf War. And we've all maybe heard the story, for instance, of the expulsion of Palestinians from places like Kuwait in the wake of the Gulf War. Well, who else gets expelled in large numbers? Hundreds of thousands of Sudanese lose their citizenship status throughout the Gulf countries and are sent back home. And what I think, like the Palestinians and the Yemenis, came actually as a shock to them, right? Many of them had thought that as, fellow Arabs of long-standing residents in the Gulf states since the 1970s, that they've had a kind of semi-permanent status. Sure, we weren't citizens, but it was unthinkable that we would be exiled. And it's in this framework that you see writers like the Sudanese intellectual Hassan al-Turabi making the argument, writing in the wake of the Gulf War in 1991 and making a sort of challenge, right? He argues that the Muslim has the right to reside anywhere in the Muslim world, right? There is no such thing as citizenship. And this idea of using passports and borders between co-religious is anathema, right? But you could see this as a response to the vast expulsion of his fellow countrymen following the Gulf War in 1990. And in the book, I argue in some ways this is the closing or the beginning of the closing of what had been a promise from the 1970s that there could be a more equal relationship, right? After 1991, there will not be a more equal relationship, right? The kind of relationship is sort of fixed as one in which the Gulf states will still rely heavily on the resources of Africa, but there will be no promise of a kind of more just equal balance of forces. And then the 1990s, one response, or from 89 and the 1990s, one response in Sudan is the creation of an Islamic State. You see the coming to power of the Sudanese version of the Muslim Brotherhood, which had by that point become independent, the Harakat Islamiyah, with the Sudanese military. And going back to the 1980s, one of the things that you start seeing is that the revolution in 1989 in Sudan, in some ways, was meant as a sort of test case for this model of Islamic republicanness, or you see writings about an Islamic constitutional monarchy. And one of the things I'm trying to work on or explore is the extent to which Sudan serves as a model, but actually for a case that was hoped to be applied actually in the Gulf states themselves, right? That this could be re-exported or perhaps was hoped to be developed in the Gulf states. And that would have, in some ways addressed this problem of citizenship, right? Could you have a change in the model of the Gulf monarchies, perhaps a constitutional monarchies, and would that give greater rights to the residents that were there? And you can see in the ways in which Hassan al-Turabi is talking openly in the early 1990s about this question. He says Sudan will serve as a sort of meeting place from which reform of the region can be exported. But it's happening in the mid-1990s at another moment, in sort of the Horn and East Africa in general, in which we're seeing the rise of a kind of new Pan-Africanism. We see Museveni in Uganda. The Ethiopian civil war has now been resolved, and you get leaders like Meles Zenawi, Isaias Afwerki, and others. And we see the rise of John Garang also in the in sort of the 1990s. And this question in Sudan, the challenge is this question: should Sudan be the sort of Islamic republic, or should it be the new Sudan, a Sudan that becomes more at home with its African neighbors, and also sort of this sort of post-Cold War revolutionary moment in East Africa, and how to reconcile those two images, right, or those two ideas. And the 1990s become actually one of Sudan's most violent decades. More than 2 million people die in the civil war in the 1990s. But it's also this important ideological clash or geopolitical clash of where Sudan will orient itself, and the difficulty of sort of reconciling this problem. And it's in this context that, someone like Hajj Hamad actually is still active. By this moment, he's long lost his Sudanese passport, but he's sort of back in the Horn of Africa now as a senior advisor to Isaias Afwerki. Somewhere along the way, he switches from the ELF to the EPLF. He was an incredibly ideologically flexible person, but in the mid-90s, he is a senior advisor to Isaias Afwerki, and he's again pushing for this question of trying to organize the Sudanese opposition, but also thinking about what he calls a confederation for the Horn of Africa. This question of how to deal with the binaries, that he recognizes this idea of colonial binaries as being sort of the main struggle in the Horn of Africa, and sort of undermining any hope of a kind of new Pan-Africanism or an Islamic republicanism or any of those things. And you also see him returning as he re-narrates in the 2-volume history of Sudan in the mid-1990s, to the image of Kush, Nubia, and this question of whether or not, he uses the idea of recentering international relations around kind of the Horn of Africa, and he uses the imagery of Nubia as the time of Sudan's greatest geopolitical import. And so you can see, this call back into the current revolutionary moment in Sudan. Nubia is returning again as an important image of what Sudan could mean, how it could fit into contemporary geopolitics. And it's a little bit outrageous that, Isaias Afwerki, through people like Hajj Hamad, proposes the Confederation of the Horn of Africa. But in thinking of the wars that are wrecking the Horn at the moment, you can kind of see that in the mid-90s, they can already see this coming, right? So for instance, he's like, Ethiopia will not be stable, even as it becomes, a federation of the nationalities of Ethiopia. He's like, the question of Eritrea and Ethiopia is completely unresolved. The desire for a Tigrinya confederation will remain. The Amharus, neither the Tigrinya nor the Oromo will be able to trust the Amharu. In Sudan, he's like, the sort of north-south divide is sort of unresolvable in its current framework. And he narrates the ways in which these problems, extend out into Djibouti. At certain moments, he talks about Somalia. And for him, the answer was actually making the units bigger, right? He was like, through closer coordination of Addis Ababa and Khartoum, actually these different groups will be able to find that they have more sort of breathing space, right? That these confrontations will not be binary confrontations, but can be transformed into differences that are more manageable. And to what extent that's, possible is another debate. But it was one vision of what could possibly be an answer to the wars that have broken out recently, right? And the idea that we are seeing, the possibility of war restarting in South Sudan, very difficult to imagine a swift end to the war in Sudan. Ethiopia continues to have serious tensions with its relationship with Eritrea, and also deep tensions inside, and the confrontations in Somalia. You can see ways in which it perhaps would be helpful to revisit some of the ideas of the 1990s of how these problems could be solved. And in a kind of aside, I was just reading, some more hopeful scenarios of the near future for the Horn, and they do fall back on these ideas, right? They fall back on the idea that you need closer coordination between Addis Ababa, Khartoum, and Cairo, and that one of the ways in which to do it would be, for instance, shared energy infrastructure, right? And so, you see the GERD Dam potentially providing the water resources, but also the electrical resources to stabilize Sudan, and then to turn Sudan into an energy exporter to countries like Egypt. And then Egypt, into Europe, which maybe will need more energy as well. And so these ideas are constantly there, and there are also ideas that were there even in the colonial period, right? So you see the British have already worked out, some of these ideas of Eastern Nile management. And so it's interesting to think about the ways in which these ideas return and how practical they could be. But at the present, organizations like IGAD seem to be sort of hapless. We're at kind of a nadir of African multilateralism. And so it does seem very difficult in the present to imagine that that the corner could turn so quickly. But I was also encouraged in this, thinking about this project. I think it was 2018, and I was in Sudan, and I was taken to this new think tank of, sort of younger Sudanese in their sort of mid-20s, who had done it was interesting to see the recruitment strategy. They had all done their first degrees or their undergraduate degrees in Sudan, but then they had mostly done masters abroad, and they were being recruited into these new think tanks created sort of with the permission of the regime, but with the idea that they would support reform. And this, what would reform in Sudan look like? And they were explicitly looking at the Ethiopian model at the time as a successful model of a new developmental state. But they were also, I was surprised to see still reading people like Hajj Hamad. And for them, the question, and this becomes a question for Hajj Hamad as well, is there a future for, one of the reasons he rejects John Garang is that he imagines that John Garang's New Sudan emphasizes a kind of secularism, a Westernism that he doesn't think the vast majority of the Sudanese people will accept. But he thinks that the kind of and he often refers to them very derogatorily as the Arab Afghans that he sees around somebody like Hassan al-Turabi. He says, they're bringing a kind of Arabism from their experience, fighting even in places like Afghanistan that will not take hold in Sudan. And so, he proposes this idea of an African Sufism, and here he doesn't mean actually African Sufism, but, a kind of social science project for thinking about what a more coherent identity for Sudan might look like. And, you could see this still being kind of worked through. These ideas are still, I think, being struggled with amongst, Sudanese reformers today. I mean, the fault lines are pretty strong. Some people, want a secular Sudan. Some people want a non-secular Sudan. But I think a kind of general consensus is there a way to kind of find the middle path. And then also you start seeing this huge rise in Sudanese graffiti. And I think in some ways it was kind of blasphemous in the earlier period, the use of faces and things like that in public spaces. But you start seeing this kind of neo-Nubian graffiti everywhere. And it says, La tansu anana kulana baladin wahidan, right? Like, never forget that we were all once one country. And it's kind of giving greetings to the neighboring countries. And so, people like Asli Diab, who's another one of these younger Sudanese diasporan artists based in Doha, have been doing huge numbers of public projects all across Sudan and in Sudanese neighborhoods in places like Egypt, but also in the diaspora in the West. Sort of repropagating these kind of ideas that there is a possibility of a unified sort of Sudanese or even Horn of African identity, and that it has this kind of, neo-Nubian reference point to it. And then the last thing in closing, neo-Nubianism is clearly not like it's not an unproblematic solution to the problem, right? I mean, it is being used in many ways, particularly in the current fighting. It's interesting in the ways in which elites are able to reframe their identity without challenging necessarily their elite status, right? And so, in some ways, the same communities that pushed what we might consider to be the project of Arabization are also the same communities that are now pushing the project of Nubianization or Africanization. And I think in some ways they're doing it in ways that are meant to preserve their elite status in moments of geopolitical uncertainty. And while neo-Nubianism can be used sort of in the broadest sense to think about bringing the whole of the Horn of Africa together, or it is also a very exclusivist project, right, in other ways, right? I mean, it always had a hard time with South Sudan. And so, you see someone like Hajj Hamad say, we are people from Darfur to Somalia. We are one people. But he never really, for instance, thinks that the South Sudanese are part of that project. Or in the current civil war, we're seeing communities that, maybe 10, 15 years ago would have both thought of themselves as Arab, using this kind of reference to Nubia as a way of saying, the Darfurian Arabs, for instance, are not like us, right? That they are aliens, they are foreigners. And Sudan has always been the ability to deploy the problem of West Africans and to use that as foreigners, but also the West Africans can become Arabs, right? So it's a very interesting overlay of who are the Arabs and who are these foreigners that are coming into the country. And so now you hear this constant rhetoric, for instance, that the RSF is full of Chaldeans or other West Africans, that they were never Sudanese to begin with, that they're Arabs, but we've never been Arab. And, those are these invaders that are coming in. Thank you guys again.
Before we go back to the actual substance.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, the current conflict in Sudan is very tragic, right? I mean, in 2019, we saw what in Sudanese historiography and many Sudanese activists would narrate as the third democratic revolution in Sudanese post-colonial history, right? The first being 1964, the second being 1985, and the third one being in 2019. Each of these revolutions has created a sort of democratic or civilian government for a number of years. And unfortunately, in Sudanese history, regional forces and the balance of power in the military and other parts of society have usually led after no more than, say, about 4 years to a return to military rule. Each of the military rules is getting longer, which is also not a promising development. Each period of military rule is getting longer. But the current war sort of breaks out after but most of these revolutions have been civilian-led. That's been one of the core demands of the Sudanese people. And one of their, slogans is Medania, civilian-led rule, a return to civilian control. And what that means, there can be debates about, but in Sudan, it was led largely by a kind of umbrella groups. One might say the Forces of Freedom and Change, sort of representing a kind of grand coalition of the older parties, the labor unions, more established forms of civil society. And then this novel development of the neighborhood resistance committees, which were kind of these sort of popular movements that sprung up at the local level, but which coordinated between neighborhoods, which continue in Sudan to provide many of the basic services, even as the war has gone on. But they allowed protests to occur weekly in Sudan against what they saw to be, sort of revolutionary backsliding or the abrogation of the promises of the uprising in 2019. And they happened almost immediately. And it was through this that, the military was forced, for instance, to create a transitional authority, which shared power with civilian-led technocrats. But also they protested the IMF coming in and suggesting, for instance, that there would need to be austerity. And so it was already a very contentious relationship. One of the finance minister was a former official in the World Bank, a very respected Sudanese economist, Ibrahim al-Badawi. And even he, though he initially came in with the idea that he would do massive subsidies cuts, was forced to say, look, the Sudanese society cannot sustain this level of austerity that's being demanded of us. Also, unfortunately, one of the initial compromises was that the military budget would not be under the control of the civilian technocrats. The size of the military budget is a bit opaque and slightly unknown, but many people suggest that perhaps 80% of Sudan's revenues are going to the military budget, either directly through through budget support, or because the military controls military security services or other allied paramilitaries, control the largest corporations and most productive sectors in the country. The balance of power could be revealed early when Hemeti loaned the bankrupt Central Bank of Sudan $2 billion initially upon coming to power as vice president. He made a personal guarantee. But where did he get this money? How much money does he have that he was able to give $2 billion on short notice? These questions remain mysterious, right? And they show a kind of balance of power. But also one of the demands of civil society was this idea that there would be accountability for crimes committed both against civilians during the uprising in 2019 and possibly the opening of other files of crimes committed in Sudan's many counterinsurgent wars. And this was a red line for the officer corps within the Sudanese armed forces. And I think, 2019 was definitely a red line for people like Hamdan Daglo. And in 2021, predictably, when the transition was supposed to move to its next phase, so there was supposed to be a rotation between military governance and civilian governors and something called the Sovereign Council. A coup happened, or what they call it, an auto coup, where you coup yourself. A sort of palace coup happened, where Burhan, the supreme commander of the Sovereign Council, realized, just kidding, we can't give power to civilians. And he locked up his prime minister in the palace. It was a bit of a crisis. It was unclear that Hemeti was that excited about this coup, but he went along with it. And the idea, I think, was to pressure the civilians and the resistance committees to drop their demands for transparency or accountability. They tried to reinstall Hamdok several months later, but I think the question of whether or not Hamdok had cooperated also in the auto coup kind of ruined his legitimacy. And the military was forced to rule from 2021 or 2022 to 2023 in its own name. And this meant that there would be no subsidy relief. There was not foreign aid from Western countries, was largely limited. And one of the immediate challenges was the question of whether or not there would be, what do they call it? A security sector reform and what that would mean. And so the Egyptians eventually mediated in December of 2022, something called the Framework Agreement, in which they suggested that the paramilitaries, the militias, and the Sudanese armed forces would merge into one standing army. Everyone initially agreed to this with serious questions about when this would happen, the timeline, and perhaps an equally serious question of rank. How would paramilitary ranks transition into conventional standing military ranks? This was a serious issue of contention. And the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, by this time had swollen in size to what people estimate to be 150,000 people. So also, how are you going to move these vast numbers of people into a conventional army? It was Ramadan in 2023. It was the last 10 nights. We don't know exactly what happened, but there was an attack on an Air Force base. There was an attack on a Rapid Support Forces base in southern Khartoum. By the next day, the Rapid Support Forces had largely taken over Khartoum, and the commander of the Sudanese Armed Forces was trapped in the basement of his own military command. But the Rapid Support Forces were not able to kill Burhan, so they killed the family members of many of the senior Sudanese Armed Forces officers. And Hemeti seemingly announced that he had made a deal with the civilian opposition to perhaps do another coup. But the Sudanese Armed Forces regrouped. It looked like they were done, but they regrouped in eastern Sudan, perhaps with the support of the Egyptians. Hemeti found that he was not able to shake off his associations with the Janjaweed, and the militias that had committed horrific crimes in Darfur. As the Sudanese professional diaspora was expelled from Khartoum and they, went to the outside world, the diaspora regrouped and advocated for, kind of the isolation of Hemeti. Many of us were surprised by the Biden administration's unwillingness I don't know if we were really surprised, but we would say we were surprised by the Biden administration's unwillingness to take a firm stand on the Sudanese civil war. And we now have reports that senior Biden advisors explicitly communicated that they could not sanction the rapid support forces because that would involve sanctioning the UAE. And the UAE was seen as too important to American strategic interests to put significant pressure on them. But also the Biden administration was also unwilling to really support the Sudanese armed forces because of their connection to the old regime of Omar al-Bashir and the idea that they were connected to Islamist forces. And so for the Biden administration, it became a kind of wait and see approach. I think many of us were surprised by how poorly the Sudanese armed forces performed initially. One of their significant problems was that actually for several decades now, they have outsourced infantry fighting to paramilitary organizations. And they actually lacked significant infantry in the initial battles. But now one of the most dangerous things is that both sides have had to do ethnic recruitment, right? So both sides have had to recruit civilians into new paramilitary organizations, new militias in order to fight. And it is the success, a multi-year success of recruitment in Eastern Sudan that has allowed the retaking of Khartoum, along with the introduction of new drones. And so just like the war in Ukraine, we are seeing a large-scale drone war occurring in Sudan. And we're seeing the development of new battle techniques, right? So many of these wars are probably the wars that show us what the wars of the future will look like. And we also are not sure. It's also very hard to assess the coordination that occurs between the rapid support forces and the Sudanese armed forces, right? I mean, at one hand, they are enemies, but they are also, I mean, these are fighters who have fought together for decades. And so it is very unclear whether or not they engage in kind of planned withdrawals or swapping of other types.
I want to get back to the 1970s, but since you mentioned the Biden administration, I was just wondering Trump's first term and the Abraham Accords, what kind of impact that had within Sudan?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was a great question. I think, so I mean, many of the Sudanese civilian opposition, which kind of takes root in sort of the late 80s, early 90s, and the purging of Sudan's, much like the 1970s, the 90s see a huge exodus of Sudanese professionals, right? It was already occurring in the 80s, but the 90s accelerates it. And many of the international organizations, right, many educational institutions, many of the mid-career and senior Sudanese officials are forced to go into exile, right? The civil servants are forced to go into exile. And they kind of form a new core of the Sudanese civilian opposition from the 1990s. And for them, I think also for part of the Bashir regime, their goal had been to reverse the isolation of Sudan, which occurs in the mid-1990s. Sudan gets put on the state sponsor of terrorism list. Sudan defaults on its IMF and World Bank loans. Sudan owes more than $50 billion, maybe $60 billion to international organizations that before it could even start to borrow again from the international community. These were the highest priorities for the Sudanese sort of technocrats that come to power in 2019. And for them, that meant repairing their relationship with Washington. And the Sudanese armed forces, I think, partially allowed the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir because they also wanted to repair their relationship with Washington, right? I mean, it was a new consensus. And Trump introduced this very transactional element into policymaking, which actually might have been the cynic in me. It was like Sudan might still be on the state sponsor of terrorism list if Trump hadn't been there, but it created this price, and the price that was demanded was that Sudan would recognize Israel, would pay $500 million that it didn't really have, and begin the process of liberalizing its economy in exchange for sanction relief, being removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list, and gradually other sanctions. The challenge for the Sudanese was they didn't have a parliament. And under this transitional agreement, this is something that recognition of Israel was something that should have been debated in parliament and passed by the civilian part of the government and the foreign ministry. But because these institutions were not yet fully set up, the only institutions that could do this were the military. And so we see Burhan, the commander of the armed forces in Uganda, under the auspices of Museveni with Netanyahu. And suddenly there's an announcement that actually Sudan has changed what is Sudanese policy since 1967 to recognize Israel. And so for many observers, it was a serious moment of undermining civilian authority, if only at the procedural level. And of course, it's solidified perhaps the worst tendencies in the US-Sudanese relationship, which since 9/11, perhaps before 9/11, has principally been a relationship between the US security services and the Sudanese security services, right? The civilians have been largely ignored in this relationship.
I have a question. So, I was wondering in terms of stabilizing the region, I guess you call it Afrabian. So within that region, isn't it possible to, I guess this is an Islamophilic perspective, but could you use a religion of Islam to like kind of create that kind of connection, if that makes sense? Because like, if everyone in the majority of this region is Muslim, then it should be easier to like, what should I say this, like, talk about the past in a way that reflects their own belief systems in the modern era, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think for many in Sudan, right, that was the idea, right? So coming out of the 1970s, for many, what we might call the Sudanese Islamic movement, which was, sort of had many different factions within it. The idea was that, it was the Islamic identity of Sudan and Northeast Africa that would serve as the basis as a kind of unity. And it was interesting also in the question of, perhaps a crude reading would be like, it's export from Arabia, but for many of the Sudanese and other, Sahelian Africans, it was they who were exporting Islamic knowledge to states like the Gulf. I mean, states like the UAE, right? And so they had the expertise, the knowledge, the human capital. And the idea was that it could be an exchange for, more material support, or for their own development projects. And we see a lot of this, right? I mean, one of the largest bilateral donors in the 1960s is Kuwait. And many of the Sudanese professionals are able to go and they're able to form things like the Arab Fund for the Development of Africa, which is based in, or for African development, which is based in Khartoum. And so there is a kind of institutionalization that, it is on our shared Muslim, shared maybe Arab identity, that cooperation should unfold. But then what becomes the problem with this perspective, right? And so in Sudan, this perspective leads to changes in the Sudanese political dynamic that, of course, restart conflict. And, some people would say that Numeri, who was Sudan's second military ruler, by all accounts, this was a very secular man, right? I mean, he was not considered to be particularly pious. He was not Islamically knowledgeable. He was a large very public consumer of alcohol and, a kind of frequenter of the Western hotels in Khartoum. He was a military man, in the kind of classic mold. Kind of he started as an Arab secularist, but he would impose Sharia law in 1983. And the important thing about his imposition of Sharia law was that it violated the terms of the 1972 peace agreement with South Sudan. It violated their autonomy. It violated the recognition of rights for non-Muslim peoples in Sudan. And there were other things he did in terms of military organization that made Southern officers feel that they were about to be purged. But this is the context in which the Sudanese Civil War, Second Sudanese Civil War restarts. And so I think for scholars like Hajj Hamad, the idea is that, look, Arabizing Sudan is not going to be a successful strategy, right? It will lead to war. And for many of them, the other issue was Ethiopia. Ethiopia was a majority Christian nation. They saw it as crucial to this regional formation, but it could not be incorporated through an Arabization, through an Islamic Arabization project, right? And that becomes one of the things that Hajj Hamad criticizes the Turabi regime for in the mid-1990s, the idea that he was arming Oromo separatists and reflaming this idea of Muslim conquest of Ethiopia, right? And so the question is, could you build these bonds, but you would have to find an ideological framework in which, it wouldn't inflame older tensions. Oh, okay. I don't know if I can see it, but.
So what common mistake, this is from Solomon, what common mistake do the Afrabian nations share that makes them perpetually politically unstable and dangerous?
That is a good question. I think one of the challenges, and I think this is perhaps the best case for something like Afrabia, and you see this challenge in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s it has been very tempting for regimes in either Khartoum or Addis Ababa to use political developments in the other one to argue for international support, right? And so a kind of sense of rivalry between the different states in this region, I think, has definitely undermined regional stability. You can see with Somalia, for instance, as well, and during the Cold War, it was frequently a kind of toggling back and forth between the US and the USSR. So Sudan in the 1980s is like the third largest receiver of US military aid. But then, once Ethiopia comes back online, the US has no use for Sudan. And so you have these kind of boom bust projects of regional engagement. And right now, you're seeing a kind of competition for Gulf state support that pits various countries in this region against each other, as opposed to sort of forming a kind of more united front.
Another question, it's a vast area, but regarding the wider Horn of Africa, Sudan and Egypt together, and notwithstanding the many different languages, are there examples of a unified cultural memory of push for the Nubian era before circa 200 that you refer to? For example, commonly spoken of historic figures, music, everyday expressions, or proverbs that people use.
I mean, you can kind of see, a kind of musical and those kind of some cultural elements that are clearly shared, but I think it is also hard, right? So I think what people like Hajj Hamad are doing, and you see it in the frame of a kind of new Sudanese social science coming out of the 1980s. There's this movement, the Islamization of knowledge, which actually is kind of a global movement, but among sort of Muslim thinkers in various countries. And they're very steeped in what we might consider to be, normal social science, but they're trying to kind of, and they're often criticized actually for being kind of culturally Marxist, but they're trying to sort of accept the kind of Gramscian critique of hegemony and to invent new cultural symbols that can be used to mobilize these shared identities. But I think it's very much a project not of reclaiming something that actually exists dormant, but of sort of inventing something in the present. And so in the revolution, there was like, this example of the most famous photo of the Kandaki, and the idea of the Nubian queens being brought back. But these are very conscious attempts to take things that might not be so apparent in the cultural memory and put them in the cultural framework. And in this article I was reading about regional integration recently, it can even be small things. So like, instead of framing the Gerd Dam in Ethiopia as an emblem of Ethiopian economic development or a national development project like the Aswan Dam in Egypt, they were saying, for instance, if you start using phrases like our Nile, a kind of idea that it's always been a shared Nile, it's always, been this treasure that we, as the three riverian countries, share together. But I don't know to what making these kind of changes can seem kind of subtle. They can seem kind of not big, but they're also huge.
Thank you very much. And it's a very complicated region and they're kind of often neglected in terms of relationships, cross-regional relationships in Africa and the Arabian world. But looking at these geopolitical forces, what role does oil play, and China, for instance? How does China navigate this? And are they a good force, neutral force? Are they improving things? And also the idea of Afrabian, the separation of the states, that Sudan and South Sudan, I thought that would have helped things to dissipate, and then why the current forces as well. So
those are great questions. I do think the question of oil, I think a lot of this, and I'm something I haven't worked out fully, but a lot of it is an oil story, right? The migration of the 1970s is an oil migration, or not so much the development of oil, but a rearranging of the ways in which the profits from oil will be allocated. And the 1970s also sees the nationalization or the emergence of state oil companies as the most dominant oil, or as what will become the dominant oil companies that they are today. So something like Saudi Aramco is a product of the 70s, and is perhaps the largest oil company in the world. But that's very much undergirding this story, right? And then in the present, there's this question also of the future of oil, right? And so the ways in which different Gulf states are managing this question of oil's future is also shaping the relationships with the region. And so on one hand, it's caused stress. The country to particularly northern Sudanese communities that used to reliably be able to send their slightly underemployed relatives, right? You could send them easily to the Gulf states to work. And there was a kind of easy absorption, right? But that is, being challenged in the present as states try to diversify and employ their own people. There's a kind of rising nationalism, but also there's an increased competition, right? And so in Sudan, I think part of what undid and maybe lays the kind of political economy framework for the current war is that actually South Sudan, this partition of South Sudan means that 3/4 of the oil fields that Sudan used to have are now located in South Sudan. And in 2012, the initial conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, even though it's brief, is about sharing oil profits. And South Sudan responds by cutting off the oil pipelines, which sends Khartoum into an economic crisis. Sends South Sudan into civil war and Khartoum into economic crisis. And it's in response to that crisis that Sudan develops the strategy of the Rapid Support Forces as a private mercenary organization. It becomes an export, right? Soldiers become an export of the Sudanese state, but also the development of gold. And that, shifts the political geography, the political economy geography of Sudan. And I think allows the rapid support forces and Darfurian militias to become more economically independent of Khartoum than they would have been in the time of the pipelines. Pipelines were really great for the armed forces because they're static, and you could easily patrol them, and the profits were centralized. And so losing that has also led to this new instability in the region. And then different Gulf states have different strategies for managing it. And so the UAE, for instance, believes that the super profits from oil will run out, perhaps by 2050. Or, they have different strategies for managing. And so perhaps they're taking a more aggressive foreign policy in the Horn of Africa as well, as they think about what the future of the region might look like.
So just thinking about the UAE on this, I've been sort of following, not that closely, but I'm interested in the question of how UAE is projecting power in Tanzania, for example, and they will come off as villains, sort of. So I'm wondering about how UAE frames itself. And I know that, yeah, I'm curious about how it's framing itself. Does it speak in terms of empire? Is it like, there are so many elements that of UAE's behavior in East Africa over the last decade or so that would seem to refer back to this older Arab slave trade citizen. So I'm just wondering how that plays out.
No, I think that's a great question. I think it's interesting because, from the 1970s onwards, I think the rulers of the Eastern Mediterranean are very aware of the problem. They're very aware of both the opportunity and perhaps the problem associated with their integration, their return to East Africa, right? And so from very early on, this dialogue, this question of the slave trade, this question of exploitation, this question of being the Arab slave traders is there, right? It seems like it's there from the very beginning, but also this question of opportunity. And so, like when you hear places like Dubai tell the story, very early on, before it became luxury Dubai, right? Where do they go? Who are the first shoppers? One of the things that they do is they open up to African shoppers. And they basically are able to resell rather cheap goods from China and places like that to African markets. And they would say they're underselling or providing more diversity of market opportunities than you were getting, for instance, if you had gone to London or Paris. They provide cheaper flights. They provide better connections between African cities. I think their positive model is kind of the Emporium model, or the classic thing they're always saying, which doesn't make any sense from as a historian, your head wants to blow up. But, they say ever since Andalusia, the Gulf states have been a meeting place for the peoples of the world. And you're like, are you guys the descendants of Andalusia? Like, what exactly are you saying? But I think that would be their refrain, right? That they're providing the services that no one else is willing to provide, and that they're a market. And the market idea, I guess, has upsides and downsides, because they probably would respond by saying something like, we're a neutral market, and that's why we're only doing the minimum required verification of who you are, but we're providing you market access. And if you went to London, you might not be able to get in. You might not be able to get a visa. All of these sort of problems, can kind of be provided, can be solved. The UAE would say, they're safe, right? So you've come into a large sum of money in Nigeria, and you've come to wonder if you're safe in Abuja. Well, you could be safe in the UAE, and you could live next to your political rival in a secured environment, with easy banking, platforming facilities. And they would probably say it's not us to ask. Like, it's none of our business, really, how you acquire this money, except for the pesky Americans who might eventually pressure us to ask questions. But, they're very proud of like banking the Ukrainians and banking the Russians. And I think they're very proud of banking the SAF. And maybe now they're under some pressure, so they're less proud of banking the RSF. But I don't think they're ashamed of banking the RSF at all. Like, I think or Ruto, right? Like they're clearly banking the Kenyan elite. Yeah, and I think that's what they would say, you can talk to anyone here. In the US, it's becoming hard to talk to, for instance, the Chinese, right? But you can come to Dubai and you can talk to the Chinese, and then you can meet the Americans, and you can see who's willing to give you a better deal.
So essentially, they're like the bank teller from Monopoly.
Yeah, I think Dubai, yeah, I think Dubai in particular would like to be the bank teller from Monopoly, right? Or like a casino, right? They're like, you want to come here, you want to set up a club. And it's been surprising to me, as an African American, it's been very surprising to me how many African Americans are going to Dubai. And they find it to be like a very comfortable. I was on the plane and I was in the middle of this girls' trip of all like African American women from Texas. And there must have been like 20 something of them. And I was kind of confused. I was like, it's far away. What are you guys going to do there? But like, it was clear they were going to party. And then one of them was like, I'm going to come back next year. And like one of my friends has her Haitian relatives. They keep going too. They fly from New York and they go to Dubai. I think and I lived there for a brief period of time in like 2015 or 2016. And it's going to sound really bad, but it was in the post Trayvon Martin moment. And I was coming from Philly. And you're in an authoritarian state, but I felt kind of relaxed. I was like, nobody's going to shoot me. Like, I don't think that's not one of the possibilities. And people are I guess there's a way in which you expect a kind of, on the interpersonal level, you don't necessarily encounter the kind of upfront racism that you might encounter in another setting. Also, as a Black person, there's this weird thing where you're clearly not at the bottom of the social hierarchy. You're not at the top, but you're not at the bottom. Because very unfortunately, there are people at the bottom and they're wearing jumpsuits and they mostly come from South Asia. And so immediately you're slotted in a different place. And so I imagine there's all these various reasons that people are find it kind of, it's not Lebanon or it's not Egypt where there's a different type of colorist anti-Blackness. Even the models are darker. Like you'll see the skincare models, and they're not like dark, but they're a sort of brown that you're not kind of used to. And so I don't know, maybe it does. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, but.
We're out of time. Thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. So, big thank you.
Thank you, guys.
The date in person and online for attending this talk. We'll see you next Thursday.